friends, dear students. I am Ali Aycıoğlu. I'm a professor of Middle East, Ottoman and Islamic history and the director of the Abbasi program.
A little louder.
All right, okay. Let's try this way. Double. All right. I am Ali Aycıoğlu. I'm a professor of Middle East, Ottoman and Islamic history here at Stanford. I'm also the director of the Abbasi program in Islamic studies. I welcome you wholeheartedly. I would like to begin by announcing that this is an inaugural lecture of our newly established Forum for Middle East Studies under the Abbasi program at Stanford. This forum has been brought to life with the generous support of the Dean of Humanities and Sciences. It is our collective endeavor to delve into the histories, societies, and cultures that define the region we often refer to, albeit with qualifications, as the Middle East. We aim to make the forum as a space for fostering and promoting the academic study of the Middle East and building our existing scholarly community in this field. In the midst of ongoing conflicts, atrocities, and war crimes in the region, emotions on campuses and across the globe run high. Views are polarized, universal values and humanitarian standards are at stake. In this moment, the Forum for Middle East Studies at Stanford emerges as a space for critical, scholarly, and humanistic perspectives. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished guest for the inaugural lecture, Professor Joel Beinin. Many of you know Joel closely, not only as the Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University, but also as a guiding force in the study of the Middle East on this campus for almost 4 decades. Joel received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1982, before coming to Stanford in 1983. From 2006 to 2008, he served as the Director of Middle East Studies at the American University of Cairo. In 2002, he served as the President of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Joel retired in 2019 from Stanford and moved to Portland, Oregon. I would like to add that we want to see him on campus more often. Joel's research and writings focus on the social and cultural history and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, as well as on U.S. policy in the Middle East. He has written or edited 12 books, most recently, A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East and North Africa, published 2020, co-edited with Bassam Haddad and Sherin Saikri. His articles have been published in leading scholarly journals in English, French, Arabic, and Hebrew, as well as in South Atlantic Quarterly, Socialist Register, Carnegie Papers, The Nation, Le Monde Diplomatique, Middle East Report, the Los Angeles Review of Books. In introducing Joel, we not only celebrate once again his immense scholarly contribution to modern Middle East history, but also recognize the importance of his insight in this moment when critical understanding, intellectual courage, and academic honesty are desperately needed. The title of Joel's talk is War Crimes and Historical Context, Understanding the 2023 Hamas-Israel War. Before we proceed with Joel's lecture, I would like to emphasize the importance of fostering a respectful and inclusive environment for open dialogue. Given the sensitivity of the topics, it's crucial that we approach the Q&A session with a spirit of mutual understanding and respect. And now, without further delay, please join me in extending the warmest welcome to Professor Joel Beinin.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you all for coming. It's indeed a big pleasure to be back at Stanford. I think this is the first time I've spoken on the campus since I retired 5 years ago. And it's lovely to see so many recognizable faces, friends, colleagues, and so on. Before I begin formally, I should say that the perspective that I'm going to present tonight is more inflected by analysis of things in Israel. In part, that's because it's often what I do and what I think I have to add to this discussion. There are lots of Palestinian voices who are now prominent spokespersons from that perspective. But more than usual, that's the case because, as some of you know, my niece and her husband have been hostages in the Gaza Strip since October 7th. So it would be unfair of me not to acknowledge that this has something to do with my understanding of things. So when we talk about Israel-Palestine, it's always good to begin with the map because it's a small place, but small distances often have great critical importance. So here's the Gaza Strip, and this is the Gaza Strip as it was, and since Israel pulled out its military and settlements in 2005. Are we having a problem with this here?
Is it okay to take photos?
Is it okay to take?
Yeah, it's okay to take photos. So what's to be noticed here is the red barrier and then the pink no-go zone, meaning that Israel essentially made a good chunk of the Gaza Strip unusable for its self-protective measures, and then also that Israel has restricted Palestinian fishing off the coast of the Gaza Strip. On October 7th, in an operation called Al-Aqsa Flood, about 1,500 Hamas fighters invaded the area in the, what are we going to call that, bluish, that you see in Israel, broke through the border wall fence of the Gaza Strip in several different places. They attacked and occupied 20 rural communities, 3 towns, 8 army bases, killed some 1,200 people. Among them were 300 or more military, 5,400 wounded, about 240 hostages. 5 hostages have been returned. This was an atrocious mass murder. The victims were tortured, physically abused, raped, burned alive, and dismembered. I'm not going to engage in pornographic display of any of that, but there's lots of evidence to that.
Sorry, could you more loudly, please?
I don't know. Does this thing want to do that or not?
Let's put both together.
All sorts of things going on here. All right, does that help any?
Is good better?
Yeah, okay.
One of the mics just isn't on. That one just like isn't
No,
on.
no.
I think the one on your right is.
This one is, this one
This
is.
one's dead.
Now they're both on. Okay. So, this was a thank you. This was a major security intelligence failure on Israel's part, not just at the level of the response on October 7th, but much deeper. So how can we explain that? So one, a significant element of the military forces that are normally stationed in the Gaza envelope, Otef Azah in Hebrew, were transferred to the West Bank, and particularly to the northern West Bank, because throughout this year, but really going all the way back to 2021, settlers have been escalating tensions, attacking Palestinian villages, so that there were, in the first half of this year, 570 settler attacks on Palestinians, and 50 Palestinian attacks on Israelis in that same period, as a result of which more than 140 Palestinians died before October 7th. Since October 7th, the scale has escalated a lot. So the army was moved there, especially because it was a Sukkot holiday, and the settlers march around on Sukkot, and the army's job is to protect the settlers. And so they were simply not physically present in the Gaza area. Part of all of what's been going on in the West Bank is a slow motion ethnic cleansing. 25 Palestinian communities have been forcibly displaced since 2020, 15 since October 7th alone. So the 20 rural communities are either kibbutzim, collective settlements, or moshavim, cooperative settlements. And they don't vote for the current government by and large. There are a few exceptional individuals perhaps, but as a bloc they don't vote for the current government. And the feeling of those people is that they were left exposed by the government. So no one put it more sharply than Amir Tibon, who is a columnist for the Haaretz daily newspaper, who wrote, "The Israeli state failed us." And then on the special that Anderson Cooper did on kibbutz near Oz, which was one of the communities that suffered most horribly on October 7th, a quarter of its 400 or so residents were killed or have been taken hostage or are missing. One of the family members, one of the kibbutz members in that special said, "We were abandoned by the state." So part of why they were abandoned by the state, arguably, is a political choice. Rather defend settlers in the West Bank than kibbutzim and moshavim on the border of Gaza. But another important part is neoliberalism, and Netanyahu is one of the big champions of neoliberalism, although it would be unfair to say that this is purely a Likud party project, because it began under Shimon Peres, who was then from the Labor Party, so it's an across-the-board response, much as it is everywhere else in the world. And what neoliberalism meant in Israel was a particular version of what it's meant everywhere in the world, a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in Israel, this is called the center, Tel Aviv and its immediate surroundings, and the periphery, and kibbutzim, and also the three so-called development towns, which really should be called underdevelopment towns, that were attacked on October 7th, are in the periphery. So Israel is the 10th most unequal country among the 30 countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Those are the 30 richest countries in the world. The United States is the 5th most unequal, so we are leading the way in this lovely trajectory. I highly recommend the article that Chagai Matar, the executive director of the Plus 972 website, wrote about a week ago, in which he addresses this in the following way. The entire Israeli state is, in fact, nothing more than a hologram. The army, rescue services, the welfare services, and more have all been dysfunctional. Why? Because there's been disinvestment in the public sector. That's what neoliberalism does. That's not an especially Israeli thing, except in the center periphery way that it works out there. Years of political corruption. Netanyahu is on trial in 3 different corruption cases as the war goes on, have left us with an empty shell of a state and with no leadership to speak of. So at one point, the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, boasted the highest percentage of Knesset parliament members who were either convicted of or on trial for various forms of corruption of any elected parliament in the world. Now, another element of context is how Israel and the West have portrayed Hamas in the wake of the assault of October 7th. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was very early on to say Hamas is ISIS, that is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Daesh as it's called in Arabic. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, we're fighting Nazis. Former Foreign Minister Eli Cohen, this massacre is more brutal than ISIS. Hamas are the new Nazis, and President Biden, in his own way, went along with this depiction of Hamas by saying that they engaged in barbarism as consequential as the Holocaust. This is arrant nonsense. These are not things that should be taken seriously. As horrific as the crimes of Hamas were on October 7th, that does not make them into international terrorists. It does not make them into Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Nazis. What are they? Hamas is a jihadist Palestinian nationalist organization. It has never attacked anybody but Israelis, or on some occasions Jews attached to Israel elsewhere in the world. It's not going to attack the United States or Western Europe. All of the propagandistic language that the Israeli government has used to suggest such things are simply silly. So here you have some quotes from Hamas's 1988 charter about jihad and about the impermissibility of Jewish settlement in Palestine. I mean, the 1988 charter of Hamas is unequivocally anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about it. In 2017, Hamas issued a political statement in which it tried to moderate to a certain extent these expressions. But still, their jihad is at the center of their perspective on what should happen in Palestine. How does Hamas represent its actions? So first, everything about Palestine begins with the Nakba of 1948. As a good historian, I'd say actually long before that, but let's go back at least that far. In which 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled in fear from their country, and the state of Israel was built on the ruins of Palestinian society. Israel occupied the rest of British Mandate Palestine in the 1967 war, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. It also occupied the Syrian Golan Heights at that time. East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights have since been annexed, and the Sinai Peninsula, which was also occupied at that time, has been returned to Egypt. Since 2007, and we'll see more in detail about this in a bit, all of the Gaza Strip has been placed under a joint Israeli-Egyptian siege. They have collaborated to carry that out, but Israel is surely the lead party in that operation. There were, beginning in 2021, repeated Israeli incursions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, including videos of soldiers tramping around the mosque in their boots, which is a great act of desecration. And the holiness of Al-Aqsa is a big symbol in Palestinian nationalism, especially, obviously, to a movement which sees itself, articulates its aims in Islamic terms, but even to secularists and Christians. It's a big deal. And the last round in May 2021 of Hamas-Israel kinetic violence was occasioned in part by that. There has been, as I noted earlier, intensified ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, especially in the northern West Bank, in the Jordan Valley, in two particular neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and also in the South Hebron Hills, or Masafariyata, as it's called in Arabic. At the same time, all methods of unarmed resistance have been rejected by Israel. So both the Great March of Return, I'll talk about that in some detail in a bit, but also the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been demonized as anti-Semitism. Whatever one might say about it, for or against, it's certainly nonviolent. Israel, of course, rejected Hamas's effort to reorient itself politically in 2017, simply they're saying that the enemy is Zionism and not Jews wasn't going to do anything for a government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. So my read, they don't talk to me, about what Hamas was trying to do on October 7th is to reestablish Palestinian initiative and agency at a moment when the whole question of Palestine was essentially frozen internationally. There were no negotiations. Nobody thought that there was going to be a two-state solution or any state solution in the foreseeable future. It wasn't a question in Israeli politics since Netanyahu came back to office for the second time in 2009. That question has simply been moved off the table. Political parties, even political parties who claim to favor ending the Israeli occupation, don't raise that question in political election campaigns. It's not going to get them any votes. And everybody thought, okay, this is the way it is, and it'll be this way forever. At a press conference, Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked, so is Israel going to live forever by its sword? And he said, yeah. So that's where we were. That was not okay for Hamas. The more immediate issue, although this attack was planned at least a year in advance, maybe even more, was all of the talk about the possible normalization of relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That is certainly not going to happen anytime soon now. Hamas probably also expected that Hezbollah would join in a much bigger way than it has. There have been clashes on the northern border, but mostly within the framework of playing by the rules, if you will. We send a little rocket or an artillery barrage, you send your thing, stop. And Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, actually gave a speech the other day in which he said, we support Hamas, but we're not going to have a war on your behalf. Why? Because Hezbollah is the biggest political party in Lebanon, and they don't want to risk the population of South Lebanon being obliterated in the way that is happening in the Gaza Strip, and they want to maintain their political credibility as a responsible party in Lebanon, even as the Lebanese state has all but utterly and totally collapsed. What does Israel think it's doing in its counterattack on Gaza? Israel thinks it is fighting Amalek. So Benjamin Netanyahu quoted verses from the Torah in which he said, remember what Amalek has done to you. Jews know what this means. The commandment is to destroy every man, woman, and children of Amalek because they attacked the Israelites in the Sinai Desert on their way from Egypt to the land of Canaan, and also to destroy all of their goats and their donkeys and their sheep. And King Saul, the first king of Israel, was not allowed to establish dynastic rule. His son couldn't succeed him because he allowed the Amalekite kingdom, the Amalekite king, to live after defeating the Amalekites. So under that general rubric, Jews understand that this is a call for genocide. There's no other way that a Jew would understand that. Other government ministers and responsible people have similarly made genocidal statements. I won't run through quoting them all here. I collected all these by scanning the Israeli press and such. And then today in the New York Times, this very responsible and hardworking journalist, Mark Landler, who I didn't read before, had all of those in his New York Times articles, except for the last one by the retired general who suggests that it's necessary to create a severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza to achieve Israel's goals. He went on to say there have been 18,000 genocidal statements on X by Israelis since October 7th, and 286 statements by prominent Israelis, including the wife of Prime Minister Netanyahu, Sarah Netanyahu, advocating, inciting potentially unlawful behavior. That includes both things that should be done to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and things that should be done to Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. who have been having a very difficult time of this. So this is what the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide says. The relevant clauses are in red there. And also I note that an important part of the crime is intention. So if we judge by intention, many Israelis in responsible positions have declared genocidal intentions. Omer Bartov, a very prominent historian of the Holocaust, wrote an Israeli, wrote in the New York Times, functionally and rhetorically, we may be watching an ethnic cleansing operation that could quickly devolve into genocide. Very cautious phrasing, I think, for the magnitude of what's happening. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to argue this one way or another. You can come to your own conclusions. So in the course of what Israel has called Operation Iron Swords, 11,100 Palestinians have been killed, of them 4,500 plus children, 3,000 women, 27,500 have been wounded, 2,700 are missing, 1,500 of the missing are children, and 1.6 million people have been forcibly displaced. All of those figures are lowball estimates because the Palestinian Ministry of Health has not been able to issue updates for the last several days while fighting has been going on in and around the hospitals. And there's been lots of flap about, well, do we believe the Ministry of Health because it's controlled by Hamas? Human Rights Watch says their figures are pretty accurate, not to the last number because it's almost impossible to do that, but they're at the right order of magnitude, off a few hundred here or there at the most. Okay, now we take a big breath and step back. So what I tried to do here was give you snapshots of different contexts as they have been understood by the Israeli government, by Hamas, by the residents of the Gaza envelope, Otev Aza, and by international observers who are commenting on what Israel has done. Now, it's time to try to be more of a historian. So how did we get here? Short run. Somebody asked me to give a talk at a community event later in the month, and said, just give the context. I said, well, do I begin in 1881, 1917, 1948, 1967? So I'm going to begin here in 2005. So in August, September of 2005, the government of Israel, headed by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, decided that it was going to withdraw the settlements that it had established in the Gaza Strip since 1967, along with the roughly 9,000 settlers. And what you see here is the settlers fighting the army as the army is trying to get them to leave. The settlers pumped this up as a big traumatic experience for them, and then got tons of compensation and new housing inside Israel after they did this. So withdrawing the army, withdrawing the settlers. Why? Dov Weissglass, who was a very important advisor to Ariel Sharon, was quite explicit. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. When you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion of the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Disengagement supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu have been of the same mind on that point for a very long time. We had a little interregnum when Ehud Olmert succeeded Sharon as prime minister after Sharon had a stroke and went into a coma. And he did conduct negotiations with the Palestinians, and we can talk about how serious that was and whether the plan that was forwarded was realistic, but except for that 1 year plus period when Olmert was prime minister, from 2001 when Sharon became prime minister until today, this has been the strategy of the Israeli government. After Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, there were elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council in both the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian Legislative Council was set up as a result of the Oslo process. This was only the second time that they ever held elections, and it's the last time that there have been elections, so no one who was elected has any legitimacy today. Hamas won the election to everyone's surprise, especially Fatah's surprise, because they had set up an election system that favored them. Nonetheless, all international observers, the Carter Center, the EU, everybody said these were among the most democratic elections conducted anywhere in the Arab world since World War II. And Hamas won. They received 45% of the popular vote, but because of how the electoral system was set up, that gave them 74 seats, a majority in the Legislative Council. We ought to be familiar with people not winning a majority of the popular vote and getting the election in the United States. So you can hardly claim that that in and of itself is prima facie undemocratic. However, even as President George W. Bush was at the height of promoting democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan and all manner of other places where we have been so successful in doing that, Bush administration totally backed Israel's rejection of the outcome of this election. Basically, Israel, the United States, and the European Union demanded that Hamas abandon the platform on which it was elected, which was rejection of the Oslo process, which obviously had not at that point led to a Palestinian state. And just for parentheses, the words Palestinian state and Palestinian self-determination do not appear in the Oslo Declaration of Principles, and that is because despite having won the Nobel Prize for Peace for signing those accords, neither Shimon Peres nor Foreign Minister, and nor Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin wanted a Palestinian state. A month before he was assassinated in November of 1995, Rabin gave his final speech to the Knesset in which he explained that he did not want a Palestinian state. It was going to be state minus whatever that is. Hamas said, no, we reject this process, and they won the election on the basis of that, well, actually also on the basis of the fact that Fatah, the ruling party in the Palestinian Authority, had become quite corrupt and authoritarian, and they refused to abandon their electoral program to suit Israel and the United States. And consequently, Israel and the United States backed Fatah in their effort to carry out a coup d'etat in June of 2007. Fatah discovered the plot and foiled it before it could happen. Bizarrely, the best account of this is in Vanity Fair magazine. But there's no dispute to that account that this is what happened. In other words, Hamas did not illegally seize power in the Gaza Strip. First of all, they won an election. Second of all, Fatah tried to carry out a coup d'etat against them, and they defeated the coup d'etat. So they are where they are because they were democratically elected, whether we like it or not. So the result of that was Hamas was left in control of the Gaza Strip, but the Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, is in control of the West Bank with even less democratic legitimacy than Hamas has in the Gaza Strip, because again, there's been no election for the Legislative Council since 2006, and the last election for the presidency was also a good long time ago. So because Israel did not accept the result of the election, and because its plan to back the Fatah coup d'etat failed, Israel, abetted by Egypt, because the southern border of the Gaza Strip is on Egyptian territory, the Sinai Peninsula, imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip, restricting imports and exports, water, electricity. Israel controls everything, even before October 7th. Entry and exit, airspace, coastline, even the population register. If you don't register births in the Israeli-controlled population register, that newborn will never be able to leave the Gaza Strip. I mean, many people have not left the Gaza Strip since 2007. There's a whole generation who grew up in an open-air prison, and they are the ones who committed the atrocities on October 7th. I won't read this long paragraph here. It comes from a report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Situation in the Palestinian Territory occupied since 1967. What a mouthful. And that office has tried to document the human rights situation. They are reviled by whoever has held that office, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish or whatever, has been reviled by Israel as an anti-Semite, but their reporting has actually been quite good. And the key points here are, one, that Israel is the occupying power despite having withdrawn its military, because it controls everything from outside, and two, that the Israeli blockade is a form of collective punishment, which is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So what does Israel think it's been doing since imposing this blockade? So Doug Weissglass, again, at the point that he said this, Sharon was in a coma, but he continued in his role as advisor to Sharon's successor, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Doug Weissglass said, the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. And we know that that is exactly what did happen, because in 2008, a document was leaked in which the Israeli government was calculating the minimum number caloric intake necessary for Palestinians to avoid malnutrition, and that was the amount of food that they were going to allow into the Gaza Strip. Then there were these 4 kinetic violence campaigns. I want to use that term because the whole thing is violent every minute of every day. 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. And these operations are called in the Israeli military parlance mowing the lawn. So you have to, if you have a lawn, as we tend not to, but if you have a lawn, you have to mow it periodically. And that's what they were doing by invading Gaza and killing substantial numbers of civilians on all of these occasions, in addition to killing civilians and others on a number of other occasions. Tarek Bakoni, whose book Hamas Contained was published by Stanford University Press in the series that I co-edited before I retired, is probably the person who knows the most about Hamas, and even if I dissent from some of his recent characterizations of what Hamas has been up to, and he characterized this situation as violent equilibrium. And this is what it looks like statistically. So if you look at the graphs here, the orange are Palestinian fatalities in Gaza, and the purplish are the Israeli fatalities in Gaza. And you can see that the only year in which there's any significant numbers of Israeli fatalities are 2008 and 2014, and that's because some Israeli soldiers were killed during the Israeli invasions of Gaza in those years. And then the pink is the Palestinian killed since October 7th, and of course there's also the 1,200 Israelis who were killed on October 7th. So in a way, showing you this chart is a criminal enterprise, because in the Jewish tradition and in the Muslim tradition, there are texts that say that killing one human being is equivalent to killing the entire world. So to try to reduce this to numbers in this way is a very cruel thing, but I'm also not going to engage in pornography by showing you the pictures of the horror stories that these numbers obscure. So on the one hand, you have a strategic goal of Israel to govern Gaza in the way that will prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And this was called the concept, concepcia. And Netanyahu and his close associates were sometimes, perhaps unguardedly, quite clear about this. Chaim Ramon, former member of the Israeli Knesset, very knowledgeable about Israeli politics in a Hebrew book that he wrote, quoted Netanyahu as having said, "Those who want to thwart the possibility of a Palestinian state," which he, Netanyahu, certainly did, "should support the strengthening of Hamas." Major General in Reserve Gershon Cohen, a Netanyahu confidant, said, "Openly, Hamas is an enemy. Covertly, it is an ally." And Adam Raz, I highly recommend following this young man, excellent historian, who has argued for documents to be declassified from the Israeli archives, which is no longer a simple thing, and makes what he finds available to the broad public by writing articles, typically in Haaretz Saturday magazine, about the things that he finds out. And one of his recent articles is entitled "A Brief History of the Netanyahu-Hamas Alliance." And he writes there that Netanyahu's policy was to keep Hamas in power because it served as a counter to the Palestinian Authority. So if the Palestinian political leadership is divided, and if the Palestinians under Israeli occupation are territorially divided, you could not go from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank and vice versa, except in very extraordinary circumstances before October 7th. So this was a formula for freezing any kind of political process because, and every time Hamas and Palestinian Authority or Fatah tried to overcome the rift and form some kind of national unity government, the Israeli government responded in such a way as to block that process. And there were plenty of internal obstacles as well. So what did all of this result in? A total humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip before October 7th, 2023. So it's worth noting that almost 2/3 of the population of Gaza Strip, which is about 2.2 million, maybe 2.3 by now, are refugees or children or grandchildren of refugees of 1948. When these statistics were compiled, they're about 4 years old. 30% were below the poverty line. Unemployment was at about 50%. The average wage had declined. 70% or so were food insecure or vulnerable to food insecurity. 35% of the farmland, 85% of the fishing waters were totally or partially inaccessible. If you remember the red zone that I showed you in the open map, and then Israel's restriction of fishing in the Mediterranean, overdumping of sewage wastewater into the Mediterranean. Over 96% of the water from the Gaza aquifer is now impotable, and about 40% of essential drugs are out of stock. It's easier for you to grasp these things, which are mind-boggling, frankly. Here are some infographics that contain some of that same information. And the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development had projected in 2017 that by 2020, Gaza would become uninhabitable. So it's already 3 years after Gaza had become uninhabitable that we're talking about these events unfolding. So here I want to focus on an effort at nonviolent resistance and Israel's response to it. So in January 2018, the administration of President Trump recognized Israel's annexation of Jerusalem, and there was the inauguration of an new American embassy that actually straddles the border of East and West Jerusalem and actually is in part situated on lands owned by Palestinians, including the prominent Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi's family. And what Abu Artima proposed in a Facebook post was, all these successive humanitarian disasters in the Gaza Strip must expedite the implementation of the peaceful sit-in for refugees near the dividing line with the occupation. So what he was calling for was mass demonstrations on the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip to demand two things: right of return of the refugees and alleviation of the siege of the Gaza Strip. Ahmed Artima didn't and doesn't belong to Hamas or Fatah or any political faction, so it's important to note that he says at the end there, this is an invitation to all factions, trade unions, civil society institutions, and youth federations to take the initiative. So what he envisioned and what people initially responded to was this was going to be nonpartisan, not Hamas, not Fatah. This was going to be a popular, peaceful sit-in being conducted every Friday after prayers at the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip. And the first one happened on March 30th, 2018, which is also Land Day, a day that commemorates Israeli forces killing 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel during protest against their lands being confiscated, and it's since become adopted as a Palestinian National Day of commemoration. So every Friday between March 30th and 2018, there were demonstrations on the border. In the course of them, Hamas seized control over this initiative, because Hamas is, after all, a reactionary, authoritarian, misogynist organization, and it does not like popular initiatives from below like this. And so Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is much smaller but has a similar ideology, infiltrated the demonstrations, began to organize them in their way, which included some violent acts like sending incendiary balloons over into the Israeli side, which burned some of the fields of the kibbutzim. Not any gunfire or anything like that, but it's things that we would clearly not put under the rubric of nonviolence. And Israel responded to all of this, even before there was any kinetic violence from the part of the Palestinians, with massive, massive gunfire. Snipers lined up on the sand dunes overlooking the boundary and shot Palestinians intentionally in their legs, often aiming at their knees to disable them permanently, because the medical structure of the Gaza Strip is in disastrous state even before October 7th, and they don't have the capacity to do the kind of surgeries and rehabilitations if your knee gets shattered by a bullet. And the total number of deaths during the period when these demonstrations happened, before they were called off because just couldn't take it anymore, was 128. And on the day that the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem was ceremonially inaugurated by Ivanka Trump and other luminaries, May 14th, 2018, 57 Palestinians were killed in one day, none of them armed. So in a way, the epitome of that response to what was largely a nonviolent popular initiative is what happened to Rozan An-Najjar, a young woman who volunteered to become a medic and who was assassinated by an Israeli sniper. So when she's a medic, she's not a military target, and then when she was assassinated, the Israeli army released a video which was actually doctored, in which it tried to distort what she had said in an interview with a Lebanese newspaper, made it look like she was acting on behalf of Hamas, which she absolutely wasn't. And then there was a big investigation. Israel, first of all, denied that they were the ones who killed her. This is the typical thing. No, she was killed by a Palestinian bullet. The New York Times investigated this with great intensity. and concluded that the bullet that killed her was fired by an Israeli sniper into a crowd that included white-coated medics in plain view. A detailed reconstruction stitched together from hundreds of crowdsourced videos and photographs shows that neither the medics nor anyone around them posed any apparent threat of violence to Israeli personnel. Israel later admitted her killing was unintentional. So first they said they didn't do it, then they said it was unintentional. Times concluded, the shooting appears to have been reckless at best and possibly a war crime for which no one has yet been punished. So I would argue that the fact that Israel got away with this crime and that they got away with a similar crime against a Palestinian journalist sometime later, Shireen Abu Akleh, who happened to be a joint U.S. Citizen, so therefore that got a lot more publicity than normally it would. Israel, before October 7th, had killed over 20 journalists in the West Bank since 2000. So that impunity is what lays the groundwork for broader impunity that is at work in the current operation. So let me conclude with lessons of history, which I think there basically aren't any, but people often think there should be. So Israel has proclaimed that its objective in the Gaza Strip is to eliminate Hamas. And the idea is after we eliminate Hamas, everything will be cool. The Palestinian people will then be ready to submit to Israeli rule. I mean, the Israeli government hasn't figured out what it's going to do after it eliminates Hamas, but whatever it will be, the Palestinian people will accept it. So it's instructive, perhaps, to recall that before Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, the declared objective was to eliminate the PLO in Lebanon. And in fact, they did eliminate the PLO in Lebanon, sort of, sent them into exile in Tunis, and as that happened, as a result of that, you had the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which perhaps 2,000 Palestinians were massacred by Maronite militia allies of the Israeli army. Did eliminating the PLO in Lebanon eliminate Palestinian nationalism? Did it eliminate resistance to the Israeli occupation? Well, clearly not. In a way, you could argue that it radicalized it. Hamas didn't even exist in 1982. It only came into existence in 1988. Not only that, Hezbollah didn't exist before 1982. Hezbollah came into existence as a response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean a lot of things, but I would end with, it means that there is no military solution to this conflict, not on the part of Israelis and not on the part of Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for this very powerful, thought-provoking lecture. And we have now around 30 minutes for questions. And in the interest of accommodating as many questions as possible and ensuring a smooth flow of discussion, I kindly request the questions during the Q&A kept concise, short, and to the point. And so this will allow us to address a wide range of perspectives. And I will gather 3 questions in each time. Would it be okay?
So I haven't heard anything about the Israelis trying to rescue the hostages. And I did read that there was some negotiation that Hamas was trying to make, releasing some of the hostages, which Israel rejected. So could you talk about that?
Could you repeat the question?
I'll repeat them.
Sure. Okay, we can start.
All right. Whenever I speak, if there isn't a lot of feedback, I get nervous, so don't make me nervous. So first of all, as a matter of family policy, I'm not speaking about rumors of hostages, how many, under what circumstances might be released. It's all speculation. There's no hard information about anything, and there's no purpose to engaging in that speculation. It's psychological torture. Second, we can say that very early on in Israel, families of the hostages came to the conclusion that the government doesn't care about our family members who are hostages, because if you're engaging in massive bombing of the territory in which they are held, it's likely that some of them will be killed. And in fact, some of them have, in fact, been killed. Only one has been identified as such, I think. So the families of the hostages, after the first several days of bombing, began setting up a sit-in opposite the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, which is in the heart of downtown Tel Aviv, demanding that the government conduct a ceasefire and focus all its energies on bringing the hostages home. That has been considered treasonous. Passers-by actually spit on some of the people who were sitting in there opposite the Ministry of Defense. The other day, families of the hostages began a march towards Jerusalem. They were expecting that members of the Security Cabinet, which is responsible for conducting the war, would meet with them, but the Security Cabinet wouldn't take their phone call and has refused to meet with them. So the broad sense is that hostages are low priority for the government of Israel.
Doesn't the historical perspective of this go back to Jericho? Because it seems to me, struck me, that the defense minister's comment about killing every man, woman, donkey, and child comes straight out of Joshua. Number two, shouldn't it be the Hamas-Israeli United States war? The United States is providing all the F-16s, all the tanks, and all the ammunition. Bloomberg reported yesterday that tons of ammunition are going over there every single day.
Alex.
Could you talk a bit about your read on the contemporary political situation in the Arab states, like the Gulf, Egypt, Jordan? What do you think?
Yes, I have a friend who says that since 2006, so much aid has gone into Gaza from the Middle East and from Europe that if not for corruption in Gaza, they would have had their own electricity, water, gleaming Dubai in Gaza. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
So, first, I think it's a grave conceptual error to imagine this conflict as being rooted in biblical anything. It's true that there are powerful forces in the Israeli society today, and they're more powerful today than they were 20 or 30 years ago, for sure, who deploy biblical texts to justify what they are doing. And similarly, there are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and similar elements throughout the Muslim world who deploy Muslim texts to justify what they're doing. But this is essentially a modern conflict which is the result of political Zionism deciding, a European movement that decided that it was going to build Jewish colonies. That's the word that they used. It was not considered pejorative until after World War II to use the word colonize in a country that already was populated. When the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government declaring that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home, 90% of the population was Arab. and that didn't matter. They were the existing non-Jewish population. So it's a category error of enormous proportions to think of this as an ancient conflict. It's a modern conflict, and it's not unlike other conflicts generated by European settlement outside of Europe, including in the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Algeria and Kenya and South Africa, and we could go on. That said, yeah, there are elements in Israeli society, and they are prominently represented in the Israeli government today, who think that the book of Joshua is the most important text in all of Jewish history, and they read it that way. But if you go to any American rabbinical seminary, they spend a lot of time teaching why we don't pay attention to the book of Joshua anymore. So there's a very particular interpretation that they want to promote, which was rejected by rabbis historically. That said, of course, it's absolutely true that none of this would be possible without the support of the United States. Although at this point, I think we can see that President Biden has, in his lame way, been telling Israel to relent, don't attack this hospital, do that, and basically the Netanyahu government is not paying any attention whatsoever. And that's been the attitude of Netanyahu's governments since he came back to power in 2009. When President Obama came into office, he tried to promote a settlement freeze and so on, and Netanyahu basically gave him the finger and then came to a joint session of Congress organized by the Republican Party, and so that's a very interesting dynamic that would deserve a book, if not another lecture. How it is that Israel is simultaneously a very important ally of the United States in the Middle East, second only to Saudi Arabia, I would say, and yet Israel appears to not be paying attention to the balance of forces in that relationship, or as President Clinton once said, who's the superpower here? So there's something real going on there, but it's certainly not that Israel is the tail wagging the dog. It's a much more complicated relationship than that. Alexander asked about the situation in the Arab world. So, okay, if you look out at the Arab world, these are all undemocratic regimes with not a huge amount of domestic legitimacy. Some more, some less. Perhaps bizarrely, the absolute monarchies of Morocco and Jordan have more legitimacy than some of the regimes that have democratic forms, like Iraq or Lebanon or Syria. But no, they're all autocratic, undemocratic, repressive regimes. We should pay a lot of attention to the role of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in suppressing the popular movements, the uprisings of 2011, because they saw those movements as threats to their, they don't even have any serious forms of democracy in those countries, not even formalistically. So they have been leading the charge to repress all popular initiative, all forms of democracy across the region. Most recently, they intervened in Sudan to help the military suppress what looked like a very promising popular uprising there, and learned the lessons of the failures of Egypt, which Sudan is very closely connected to. But even though those lessons were learned, the alliance of very rich states with very vicious armed elements did it in any way. Now, everybody is talking about, well, if this war continues longer? Will Iran join in? Will it become a regional war? I would say that is a possibility because war are not things you can control and all sorts of things can happen. But Iran and Hezbollah have made it clear that, they're going to ping a little bit, but they don't intend to launch any kind of full-scale hostilities against Israel. Israel may decide that it's ready to have a war with them anyway. So you can't control this kind of thing. The much broader and deeper concern is that if this war goes on for a long time and the Arab regimes surrounding Israel are seen as impotent in restraining Israel, despite the fact that they are aligned with the United States, many people will be quite upset. While the Arab regimes have long ago abandoned any meaningful support for the cause of Palestine, the cause of Palestine is quite popular in the Arab world. So you saw that during the World Cup when Morocco had this astonishing run of victories. And what do? After they win, they whip out a Palestinian flag. And then all of a sudden, there's Palestinian flags all over the stadium. Morocco doesn't have hardly anything to do with Palestine. But, it's as far away as you can get in the Arab world. But these Moroccan football victories became somehow a symbol of Palestinian national identity and self-assertion and so on. So there is always the danger that if Israel presses too hard, something could happen in one of these countries, although at the moment, the autocrats seem to have things well under control. Aid to the Gaza Strip since 2006. There has been indeed lots of humanitarian aid to Gaza since 2006. And Israel has blown up much of it in its 4 periodic mowing the lawn operations since 2008. So has there been corruption? Sure, there has been corruption. There's corruption throughout the region. There's corruption in the administration of aid in the United States, as we learned with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So yeah, corruption is part of the political scene, but that's not an explanation for anything serious. The amount of corruption as opposed to the amount of aid delivered wouldn't be the thing that tipped the scale on that matter.
So my question is about what you said October 7th, that there was no one protecting the Gaza border because the Israeli army was more focused towards the outside. I've always heard that Israel has a very strong army, and I hear the numbers of 300,000, people not fighting or ready to fight. So how can that be possible when, the occupied territory is so small? How can everything be diverted there and not covering all the other areas? So to me, that doesn't add up. It seems like maybe Israel is very weak as compared to what we think, that it has large army and lots of weapons and it's like a real superpower in the region. So what is it? Is this real? Or is it just a hologram?
So Joel, thank you for this brilliant talk. What hope, if any, do you see?
Someone always asks that question.
Maybe also adding on to that a little, and thanks for a very informative talk. If you let history be history of everything bad that happened from both sides, what would be a more modest answer from Israel to the threat that Hamas is still posing, also taking into account that Hamas probably wouldn't line up with weapons just like that?
So I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking, and if I get it wrong, feel free to correct me. So the standing Israeli army is about 110,000 people, and it's the 360,000 reserves that have been mobilized since October 7th. So let's take 360,000 away if we're looking at the situation on October 7th. Many people have argued, I am not a military analyst, that Israel's Air Force, top-line elite. Israel's cyber intelligence, the famed Unit 8200, top-line, best in the world. The infantry, however, had been degraded as a result of basically becoming a colonial police force. Armies are not trained to break up demonstrations of teenagers throwing stones. They're trained to shoot people. And if you let the army shoot them and they kill them all, that will create total catastrophe. And plenty of kids are killed in those confrontations, but the army tries to calibrate and this and that, rubber bullets. So Israeli military doctrine has always been offensive, aggressive, seize the initiative, but then in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip until 2005, so between 1967 and 2005, that was a good long time too, they were essentially defensive, defending the settlers and the settlements. So the kind of elan and vigor that you associated with Israel's quick victories in 1956 and 1967 was gone, and you began to see that in that they had some trouble in 1973. So there's that factor that except for the super elite units, and there are a couple of others that I could throw in there, the bulk of the regular army had been weakened by playing this colonial role. Second, colonial forces, well, hubris. You don't think that these people can do anything. I mean, nobody imagined that Hamas had the capacity to do what they did, whatever you want to call it or make of it. That was simply not in anybody's playbook. It turns out that even people who are structurally in a weak position, people who aren't playing by the same playbook that you're playing by, sometimes they can exercise initiative and agency. And as I said, I think that was one of the main things that Hamas was trying to accomplish with that attack. Then there is the actual tactical question. It's not that the whole army was sent to the West Bank, because how would you have 300 soldiers killed? Otherwise, they were there, right? Let's say the deployment of the forces was disproportionately weighted toward protecting the settlements and the settlers in the West Bank because of this colonial hubris that, we have this under control, right? I mean, the conception, again, of how the Netanyahu governments thought that they were going to manage the whole question of Palestine and specifically that of Gaza. Hope. So usually I don't want to talk about that at all because my tagline on this question has always been that the most pessimistic person in the room has never been wrong when we discuss Israel-Palestine. Although I have to say that in my worst nightmare, I didn't imagine that we would be where we are here. But the Israeli government and vigilantes have been carrying out a wide-ranging and vicious campaign of repression inside Israel, the primary victims of which are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They comprise about 20-21% of all the citizens of Israel. But also directing against Jews. Palestinians have been fired from their government jobs. Some of my Palestinian former students are telling me that they are afraid to go out of their houses. There have been attacks on people in the street. A Jewish professor at a teaching college was summarily fired because he had put on his door, as it turns out, several years ago, a green Islamic flag with a dove underneath it. And after October 7th, that was considered support for Hamas terrorism. So he was just cashiered, like the union wouldn't stand up for him, nothing, boom, you're gone. And then people who have only been intimidated are reporting that they're afraid to say anything. I listened to a webinar a week or so ago in which the intrepid Israeli journalist Amira Haas spoke. I know her since she's 16 years old. She is one tough woman. She does not easily concede anything. And another of the speakers was Noah Schuster-Eliassi, who's a stand-up comic and who was brought up in the one intentional binational town in Israel, Neve Shalom, Wahet Salam, Oasis of Peace. So she's bilingual, Hebrew-Arabic. And they were being asked, so what is the Israeli left doing in these days? And they both start crying. And they're saying, nothing for us to do. We can't go, we can't do anything. Okay, so bad. In that totally terrible situation, the binational Jewish Palestinian citizens of Israel movement, standing together, Omdim B'Yahad Wa'ifon Ma'an, has been holding Arab-Jewish solidarity meetings. So they held one in Haifa. The police tried to prevent it from happening. But Arab and Jewish citizens are going to get together and comfort each other and express solidarity and concern for each other. No, that's illegal. They managed to hold it anyway. There were 300 people there. Very, very big deal. Haifa has a big Arab population. But then they repeated that exercise in several other cities. So, okay, Haifa's population is, help me here, 300,000 or thereabouts. 300 people, okay, but some people are doing this and saying no. So, what October 7th proved is that everything that the state of Israel has done about the question of Palestine is wrong. It doesn't work. And similarly, it proved that Hamas-style armed resistance doesn't work. Yazid Zayed commented that the Hamas attack was a setback, would destroy the last 10 years of work that we had built for support for the Palestinian people. So there's a chance, this doesn't always happen, that in the face of demonstrated failure of what has been done, that some people will think about what we should do, and so people are going to say, well, but that's unrealistic. How can we trust Palestinians? Blah, 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 blah. And I would just say, well, nothing else works. How about if you try treating each other like equal human beings?
How long do you give the word cabinet? How long do you give the unified word cabinet? What's your expiration date on that 10 years coalition?
In the face of more radicalization due to misinformation and discharged rhetoric, what strategies do you think might be most effective to kind of prevent that radicalization?
There's a great amount of reluctance by professors and educators to engage on this topic, and even they actively sometimes evade it. Do you think that's prudent? If not, how should professors and instructors who aren't experts like you engage on this topic, or if they should?
Okay, so because the Israeli public, the Jewish Israeli public, doesn't trust Netanyahu, he's polling now in the mid-20s, so half as much as President Biden, who's considered quite unpopular now. He had to bring people from the opposition into the Security Cabinet, which is managing the war. Benny Gantz, who, if you stood them next to each other, and Netanyahu is in favor of facto annexing the territories of the West Bank, but not de jure, but maybe de jure part of it, and the messianic right-wing neo-fascists in his government are in favor of annexing all of it, and Benny Gantz is in favor of annexing a little bit less than Netanyahu. So he went into the government, former chief of staff, so he has credibility that the rest of the clowns who comprise the current Israeli government, they're just not competent administrators in addition to everything else. I mean, you've got a minister of defense who never served in the army. Crazy. Benny Gantz will stay in there, and he'll stay in there until as long as there is the war, and Netanyahu is going to try to make this war as long as possible. The other major opposition figure, Yair Lapid, said, no, we're not going to go in there because we're going to be a minority. You're going to make dumb decisions. We're going to be held responsible for them. We're not going to have part of that. But Benny Gantz will stay in there until the war is over, and then Netanyahu will try to make the war last as long as it can, because the day after the war is over, his political career is over. Not that he will be removed from office forthwith. I mean, it might take a while. Legally, the government has 3 more years that it can remain in office unless there's a vote of no confidence. But there's already murmurs inside Netanyahu's own party, the Likud, of people not so happy with him. Yesterday, Yair Lapid, who didn't join the security cabinet, appealed to people in the Likud and said, let's get rid of Netanyahu today and have a new government, and I'll vote for a government of anybody else in the Likud but Netanyahu to be prime minister. So that's a very attractive option for people who wouldn't have had the guts to come out against Netanyahu in a normal situation. I don't know who may or may not take that up. It's a gambit out there. Maybe Netanyahu will be removed by a vote of no confidence either during the hostilities or shortly afterwards. Maybe he'll be convicted on one of the 3 corruption charges for which the trials are ongoing. So, polarization. How do I want to talk about this? So one of the problems that has, I think is a problem, emerged on many campuses, including Stanford in recent years, is that people have come to feel that education consists of having their identities affirmed. And I would suggest that part of education, and especially if we're talking about humanistic education, is raising questions about whether the identity that you thought you had at one point is actually the identity that you want to have. And maybe noting that if you're Jewish, for example, lots of Jews these days don't support the government of Israel. Or if you're Palestinian these days, Hamas would probably repress you if you were Christian, to say nothing of the great majority of Palestinian women who are under the Hamas's thumb in the Gaza Strip. So polarization means the 2 identities are in their own camp. But there aren't 2 identities. There is a camp of Palestinians and Israeli Jews and Palestinian Americans and Israeli Americans who think that it is a good thing if the 2 people live together on the basis of democratic equality, recognizing both the personal, civil, and political rights of all individuals and the national rights of the 2 communities. Frankly, I feel a lot closer to Palestinians who think that than I do to the great majority of the Jews in Israel, including sometimes members of my own family. So the answer to polarization is to contest identity politics and to say, let's see what the political field contains in terms of what people actually want. do all Palestinians actually want what Hamas did on October 7th? Absolutely not. That would be crazy to talk. I mean, the Israeli government is arguing that, but that's not true. Similarly, do all Israeli Jews, do all American Jews want what the Israeli government is doing today and for the last month and a half in Gaza? No, they don't. 5 weeks, not a month and a half. And what should professors do? That's how we can end on that, I guess. So I'm not going to tell anybody how they should conduct themselves, because there are good reasons for anyone who doesn't have tenure to fear for their job or even their personal safety in certain circumstances in universities today if they say one thing or the other. So I'll quote my doctoral advisor, who passed away a year after I came to Stanford and was no longer a source of guidance and advice, and I missed that very seriously. He said, if you're going to be a professor, then you should profess something. So for me, there was no point to this whole enterprise if I wasn't going to get up from the first day I set foot on this campus and say what I thought about this question. I got a PhD, I learned Arabic, I lived in the Arab world so that I would know what I'm talking about, so that I would feel comfortable in an Arab society and Arab culture, and so that I would try to educate my students and my community in the spirit of what I thought I knew. Now, am I the last word on this topic? Absolutely not. Somebody else has similar qualifications and may see things differently. That's fine. Let's talk about it. The notion that the thing that you should do, well, again, I'm not going to tell people what they should do. I could not have tolerated keeping my mouth shut for 6 years before I had tenure. I mean, it would have been what am I doing here? I mean, I made more money when I was working on the assembly line at Chrysler than they were coming to Stanford. So if I don't use the privilege of being a professor at Stanford to say what I want to say because I believe it's true, or at least a part of the truth, then I should go back and make more money, or maybe I should have become a